ALC crew, week 2, 2021. Here's the rundown for this week. The Roundhouse chapters 2 and 3, journal number 2, the milk was sour, and this week's to-do. So let's get started. In our next reading section, we'll gain a deeper look into Joe's life, his friends, Cappy, Zach, and Angus, and how their home lives reflect some of the larger experiences of Native people in America. We'll also meet Sanja, Whitey, and Moosham. We'll get some more details about the crime committed against Geraldine. The question of whether the suspect is Native or not will come up, which points to the complicated justice system on the reservation. Erdrich brings us into the Sweat Lodge, or the Roundhouse, where we see how Joe's community maintains their Ojibwe traditions. In Chapter 3, we'll learn about the Larks, Lyndon and Linda, as Basil and Joe look through past case files. These past case files help us to better understand the tensions between Native and non-Native people in this region. To help us work through Chapters 2 and 3, I provided a list of guiding questions in Canvas under Week 2. They're multiple choice. I suggest being methodical as you read. Answer the questions sequentially. And it's journal time. This one will be a literary analysis focusing on the aftermath of trauma. Now, Erdrich doesn't just come out and say what trauma was like in the Coots' home. She shows it. So here it is, Journal 2, the milk was sour. How does Erdrich illustrate the aftermath of trauma using language and literary devices? In your response, use the XYZ formula, 2 literary devices, and 2 quotes to support your analysis. Here's the passage that we'll analyze. It's located on page 22. The air seemed hollow in the house, stale, strangely flat. I realized that this was because in the days since we found my mother sitting in the driveway, nobody had baked, fried, cooked, or in any way prepared food. My father only made coffee, which he drank day and night. Clemens had brought us casseroles that were still sitting, half-eaten, in the refrigerator. I called for my mother softly and walked halfway up the stairs until I could see that the door to my parents' bedroom was shut. I eased back down the stairs into the kitchen. I opened the refrigerator, poured myself a glass of cold milk, and took a big swallow. It was grossly sour. I dumped the milk, rinsed the glass, filled it, and gulped down the iron water of our reservation until the sour taste was gone. Then I stood there with the empty glass in my hands. Part of the dining room set was visible through the open door. A roan maple table with 6 chairs around it. The living room was divided off by low shelves. The couch sat just outside a small room lined with books, my father's den or study. Holding the glass, I felt the tremendous hush in our house as something that follows in the wake of a huge explosion. Everything had stopped, even the clock's ticking. My father had unplugged it when we came home from the hospital the second night. I want a new clock, he'd said. I stood there looking at the old clock, whose hands were meaninglessly stopped at 11:22. The sun fell onto the kitchen floor in golden pools, but it was an ominous radiance, like the piercing light behind a western cloud. A trance of dread came over me, a taste of death like sour milk. I set the glass on the table and bolted upstairs, burst into my parents' bedroom. My mother was sunk in such a heavy sleep that when I tried to throw myself down next to her, she struck me in the face. It was a forearm back blow and caught my jaw, stunning me. "Joe?" she said, trembling. "Joe." I was determined not to let her know she'd hurt me. "Mom, the milk was sour." She lowered her arm and sat up. "Sour?" She had never let the milk go sour in the refrigerator before. She had grown up without refrigeration and was proud of how clean she kept her treasured icebox. She took the freshness of its contents seriously. She'd bought Tupperware even at a party. The milk was sour? Okay, so let's approach this prompt together. Question is, how does Erdrich illustrate the aftermath of trauma for the Coots family? From this passage, I gather that life was much different than it was before the attack. But how? I need to find some evidence. I want to find a piece of text that carries some relevance and connection to this idea of the aftermath of trauma. Let's take a closer look at the passage. Here's one. Part of the dining room set was visible through the open door. A roan maple table with 6 chairs around it. The living room was divided off by low shelves. Yeah, this is a quote from the passage, and it's descriptive, but the interior of the house doesn't really speak to the aftermath of this family's trauma. Let's keep looking. Here are some examples coded with their corresponding literary devices. It was grossly sour. I dumped the milk, rinsed the glass, filled it, and gulped down the iron water of our reservation until the sour taste was gone. Then I stood there with the empty glass in my hands. This right here is an example of imagery, sensory details that immerse the reader. Let's try another one. Tremendous hush in our house is something that follows in the wake of a huge explosion. This is an example of simile, a direct comparison using the words like or as. Even the clock's ticking. My father had unplugged it when we came home from the hospital the second night. I want a new clock, he'd said. I stood there looking at the old clock, whose hands were meaninglessly stopped at 11:22. This is an example of symbolism, an image or object that represents an intangible idea. The sun fell onto the kitchen floor in golden pools, but it was an ominous radiance, like the piercing light behind a western cloud. Here we see an example of diction or specific word choice. Everything had stopped. This is an example of hyperbole, exaggeration for dramatic effect. She had never let the milk go sour in the refrigerator before. She had grown up without refrigeration and was proud of how clean she kept her treasured icebox. She took the freshness of its contents seriously. She'd bought Tupperware even, at a party. This is an example of flashback, a return to events that happened in the past. I hope that these examples of literary devices, along with examples from the passage, help you to develop your own analysis. As you plan your response, consider the following claim starter. In Chapter 2 of the Roundhouse, Erdrich, X, uses literary device 1 and 2, Y, to show the aftermath of Joe's family's trauma, Z. So what do we have to do? 1. Read chapters 2 and 3 of the Roundhouse. 2. Write chapter 2 and 3 journal. This will be 20 points. And 3. Extra credit. To earn an additional 5 points, you may share your journal entry with our ALC community of learners. If interested, please create and submit a 1-minute recording of you voicing your journal entry. Consider using your mobile device's voice recording app. Submit the audio recording in addition to your written entry via Canvas. By submitting your voice journal, you agree to having it included in a class video that will be shared with our community of learners. Due to time constraints, some voice journals may not be featured in the class video. Next week, we'll dive deeper into the story as we examine chapters 4 and 5 of the Roundhouse. Well, that's it for this one, ALC crew. We'll see you in virtual class. In the meantime, stay safe, stay focused, and stay connected.